So I will be presenting this panel today. It's a great honor to be presenting. The title of the panel is Animal Myths and Identities, a critical exploration of the representation of foxes, wolves, pigs, and bats in popular stories and children's literature. Just for you to know, you have 15 minutes to present, and then we will have time for questions. Okay, Olympia, I will start with yours. If you can share your PPT as well. Can you check if you can? Yeah, we can hear you. Great. I am sorry in advance if I butcher your last names. I'm so sorry. Olympia Mailat-Gurkian completed her undergraduate studies in translation and interlinguistic mediation in 2019, where she chose French and English as her working language. Afterwards, she studied a master's in audiovisual translation, localization, subtitling, and dubbing, as well as a master's in advanced English studies at the University of Valencia, where she had the opportunity to delve in the field of animal studies. Her desire to explore the connections between this research area and science fiction, as well as examining the non-human animal representation in Frank Herbert works, led her to enroll as a doctoral student within the PhD program in languages, literature, and cultures and their applications. Currently, she's a lecturer in Spanish at the Université de Picardie-Jules Verne, I think. So whenever you're ready, Olympia, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for the introduction, and thank you, Sophia, as well for setting the ground for our panel. So Sophia's talked about wolves. I will be talking about foxes. As you already know by now, the fact that non-human animals have always been a source of inspiration and folkloric symbolism is no secret. Foxes are a very good example precisely because of the versatility of their representations and their manifold perceptions throughout different cultures, which is why we will try to establish a comparison between different examples of their portrayals as well as real-life treatments. So foxes in themselves are already quite ambivalent creatures. When we compare them to other popular animals, they're usually seen somewhere halfway between canids and cats, but not entirely like any of them. Their relationship with humans has also been a complex one. For instance, if you do a historical overview of it, one of the most notable things would be the history of fox hunting, especially in England. Even though the activity of hunting with hounds goes back to Greek Roman traditions, and it happened in many forms worldwide, tracking, chasing, and ultimately killing a fox using trained dogs became a custom in 1534 in Norfolk in the UK and developed into the modern tradition in the 18th century after the UK's deer population decreased because they hunted too many of them. Until then, foxes had already been considered pests by farmers and landowners, so hunting them was not a new thing, but the ritualization of the act and the breeding of hunting dogs, and later on, after the subsequent shortage of foxes in England, a demand for import of foxes from other countries like France or Germany, are factors that should not be ignored, as well as the fact that nowadays it is considered a sport. So what does it say about how we see the other animals surrounding us and the values that we ascribe to them? As Margot de Mello puts it, we distinguish between animals and classify them according to different systems, such as where they live, their biology, or in medieval Europe, according to Christian theological tenets. As she puts it, all animals were seen as lower than human, so further from God, but some were more elevated than others. And according to the folklore in that era, there were animal heroes characterized by bravery, cunning, and intelligence, and other animals that were hapless, stupid, and weak. So essentially, animals could be noble, evil, or pure. Therefore, our different treatments towards them could easily be justified by those tenets. So in these cases, foxes are seen as vermin, and in turn, the hounds chasing them are seen as tools. Fox hunting is, moreover, also a social marker for humans, as it is a practice reserved to nobility and higher classes. Nowadays, thankfully, the practice is illegal in the UK, but it has been replaced with trail hunting, which means they use traces like urine or blood, which can still lead to foxes being disturbed, chased, and killed if they happen to be on the trail that the dogs follow. Now, if we think about the meanings that foxes in particular have been given throughout history, we must adopt a multicultural approach. Usually when it comes to tales and stories, animals are given human characteristics and tend to be personified. In the European tradition, foxes are usually seen as the tricksters in the animal kingdom, usually fooling other weaker animals and lying to survive. They serve as funnels for moral messages and cautionary tales. And as Di Mello explains, animals serve as types in folklore, and the trickster is a common motive. He uses his wits to trick stronger animals into doing what he wants or to escape trouble. African trickster animals include the spider, rabbit, and tortoise, whereas the European trickster is, as we said, generally the fox, and the coyote is the most common trickster in Native American tales. What is also interesting to note, as Di Mello also, as Di Mello also points out, is that regarding the real characteristics of these animals, what appear to be real behaviors of the animals are also used in their characterization. For example, lions really do seem to be brave, dogs really do behave as if they're loyal, and foxes really do appear as to be sly. As Hans-Jörg Uther explains, the usual characteristics ascribed to the fox cunning, perfidy, slyness, and even wickedness, due to its physical and mental faculties, the fox can also be ascribed positive qualities, though, such as an ingenious mind, a readiness to care for and help others, quickness, and circumspection, since, as I previously said, the fox is an ambivalent animal in how it is perceived by humans. In certain cultures, foxes can also be seen as heroes, as is the case of the Toba people in South America, where the fox usually brings fire and can also help eliminate the effects of thread snake bites. In Europe, as Uther explains, the oldest fables that refer to foxes are found in Greek poets Archilochus' works. However, the writings of the elder Pliny and Aristotle, Aristophanes, or Herodotus are the ones who set the mainstream of the tradition. Now, of course, the most influential tales are Aesop's fables, such as The Fox and the Grapes, The Fox and the Crow, The Fox and the Stork, The Fox and the Lion, or The Fox and the Hedgehog, all of which constitute lessons about not trusting flatterers, in this case the fox, and show that tricksters, once again the fox, can be tricked in return, or that even traitors can be betrayed. In the 17th century, Jean de La Fontaine's retellings of some of these fables, as well as his own fables, with this animal at their center, such as The Fox and the Goat, or The Wolf and the Fox in the Well, which I think Sophie has mentioned, would become some of the biggest classics within French and European literature. Nonetheless, the image of the fox developed through information compiled by the encyclopedists of nature in the Middle Ages, as Uther explains. Information about reality, or simply assumed facts, were combined with fables and orally transmitted material. And so the mythical with the legendary were combined. And this image also affected folk medicinal advice because the intestines of the fox, particularly the lung and the liver, had great significance as medicine for certain diseases. Bestiaries were perhaps the most significant medieval literature when it comes to fox representation, just as in the case of the wolves, because foxes in these cases were portrayed as demonic animals. But so were the animal epics, a different kind of literature, which alluded back to historical and political developments that were taking place at the time, and even served as social and moral criticism. The most famous one that includes a fox is Reynard, which Rodprey sums up as a story with lessons for human society rather than that of the animals. And in this story, animals behave according to their God-given natures and are to be respected as such. But in summary, it's a tale about the manner in which the animals of the forest arrange their relationships and attempt to seek a form of mutual justice. As Jacques Le Goff reminds us, the entire moral life of people in the Middle Ages was reflected in the animal world. So for them, animals were symbolic representations of fear of pleasure, damnation, or salvation, and other ideas belonging to the Christian precepts. But what is also interesting about Renard, this compendium of stories and fables, is that it has counterparts in most cultures and folklores around the world, and that the fox embodies a precise social and cultural type, the trickster or deceiver. And at the same time, the story also represents the complex nature of relationship between human animals and non-human animals. It is also interesting to note the differences regarding the different versions of this story in different languages. For example, as Other explains, in the Middle High German, Reinhard Fuchs, the fox impersonates evil, but in the French version, Roman de Renard, the fox displays more sympathetic characteristics. So according to him, foxes can also be associated with spirits, witches, or with devils. For example, in the early Christian and medieval times, the Greek and the Roman negative significance that had already been attributed to foxes was developed even more, associating them with cunning people and precisely with the ruler that doesn't fear God. But in other cultures, we're leaving the European cultures aside, for example, like the Chinese, the Korean, or the Japanese ones, the fox could also change into a charming, beautiful, and deceitful woman, and vice versa, who would ruin the lives of men. Now, this association can be reminiscent of the use of the word vixen, a female fox, which we use in English to describe a very attractive young woman, in parallel with the use of silver fox to refer to a middle-aged attractive man. In other stories and cultures, the fox can also be portrayed as a helper in certain fables. After being freed from a trap, the fox can grant the hero gifts like the ability to change himself temporarily into the shape of the animal, the fox, as a reward. In Japan, foxes used to be associated with the gods as well, specifically the goddess of the harvest, Inari, because foxes killed mice that destroyed the rice crops. However, it was later when foxes took on a more rather dark symbolism, that of tricksters that could bewitch humans and could also shapeshift. So what about today's portrayal of foxes? Of course, all of the previous elements and factors that I've mentioned have permeated nowadays culture and our collective perception of these animals even since childhood. So therefore, it would be interesting to note how certain cartoons and children's stories have used these symbolisms and qualities that we usually associate to foxes to convey certain lessons and ideas. If we think about Disney, for example, they chose to portray Robin Hood, a character well-renowned for his intelligence and tactics, through a fox. However, these qualities appear in contrast with those of Honest John, the fox character and con artist in Carlo Collodi's Pinocchio, who uses his cunning and intelligence to swindle people, not help them. And then we have the story of Todd and Toby, the fox and the hound, Todd being the fox, a fox cub, and Toby, a hound puppy, who become friends when they're young and as adults have to face the reality of being natural, in quotation marks, enemies, as human society forces them to be so. Oh, sorry. Nick Wilde, one of the protagonists in Zootopia, another Disney Studios film, is charismatic, streetwise, and mischievous, interested in money, but he also has redeeming qualities, ultimately proving to be trustworthy. And then we have The Big Bad Fox and Other Tales, an anthology of stories revolving around a French farm with a fox at its center, who actually proves not to be exactly what the title would make us assume. And lastly, we have Basil Brush, a puppet fox character well known in Britain because it's the protagonist of a children's show. And this comic character is stereotypically British, which is interesting considering the long tradition of fox hunting in the UK. Then we also have notable children's literature mentions. For example, The Tale of Mr. Todd by Beatrix Potter, where the protagonist is an anthropomorphic fox that terrorizes other animals. Now, when it comes to children's literature, we have the figures of animals used in two primary ways. They are either stand-ins for humans, representing a number of characteristics that humans have or that the author wants to teach to the reader. And they can just be animals, bears, foxes, or rabbits. Another popular British children's story is that of The Boy, the Mole, the Fox, and the Horse, which has also had a film adaptation. The fox here is seen as an outcast of society that finds it hard to trust the others, and he reminds us a bit of the character of the fox in the Little Prince story. Another famous story is that of Roald Dahl's Fantastic Mr. Fox book, which was adapted into a Wes Anderson movie. Now, this story is interesting because the fox, a humanized fox, struggles to adapt to the society around him, struggles to fight his own nature, and in a way, this is also a moralistic story. I find interesting how there's certain encounters between the domesticated animals and then the wild animals, as is the case of the wolf. There's a particular scene where the fox encounters this wolf and treats him both with pity and admiration because he's managed not to succumb to society's expectations and not to give up his wilderness. And in a way, this would represent as well the fox's real struggles when it comes to adapting to living with other humans in their own environment. Now, we cannot deny that all of these stories and the historical portrayal of these animals has in some ways affected how we see them, or rather how we treat them, because foxes are simultaneously admired, feared, and misunderstood. They are not an entirely wild animal, but they aren't domesticated either. And in certain countries like England, they are common living elements both in the cities and in the countryside. Now, even though urban settings tend to be more hostile environments, they have learned to adapt to them because their diets, their survival, and their safety depends ultimately on human actions. But in a way, we can say they are also liminal denizens of our cities. The fact that our perception of them hasn't changed much is not a surprise, but the fact that they are still stigmatized and considered as pests or vermin by many, even though certain foxes or breeds of foxes are even bred and killed for their fur and used as hunting game, it is all a proof of our speciesist and human-centered approach to sharing our spaces with other living beings. They are there in our stories, in our collective cultures and memories, but we see through them, or sometimes not see them at all. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Olympia, sorry. We are going to continue with Olat Aranceta Reboredo. Whenever you can, yeah, you know the deal. Okay, so Olat is a PhD researcher in the Department of Communication at the University Pompeu Fabra and a member of the Critic Communication Research Group at the same university. Their research areas include critical animal studies, interest groups, and the representation of non-human animals. They graduated in English Studies from the University of the Basque Country and hold an MA in Media, Power and Difference from the University of Pompeu Fabra. Olat is the co-editor-in-chief of Animal Ethics Review, project manager of the Compass Research Group, and is currently conducting their PhD research title, Compassion in Spain, How Interest Groups Discourse Contribute to the Perpetuation of Animal Captivity and Exhibition. So whenever you're ready, you can start.
Thank you, Tamara. I have to say as a disclaimer that my presentation will be a lot more tied to children's literature, so I will not have those beautiful illustrations, but more of the kind that we can see on a screen. My presentation is titled The Animal, the Myth, the Legend, Pre-Representations and Resistance in Children's Literature. And today I'm gonna talk about first the different ways in which the pig has been represented, not as the animal themselves, but as a construct throughout mostly Mediterranean culture. And then I will look into how we can analyze or look into the implications of these in literature, and later do a small preliminary review of current literature that is trying to work on stories that center the experience of animals instead of so much the human experience. So to begin with, what's with the pig and the myth, and how have we been constructing it? The pig is a recurring symbolic figure throughout myths and history and stories. We can think about punishments in which humans are transformed into pigs. We can think about pigs as a representation of, for example, a capitalist pig, or in the case of class consciousness, or in the case of misogyny too, a pig with a lipstick is still a pig. Also as this kind of dichotomical way of presenting nature and animals. The pig is an interesting case because they do not represent the wild or the domestic or the human, but work within this dichotomy in a more fluid way, and I will look into that now. We will begin with a ritual sacrifice for the Mediterranean. It is the thing that, well, if most of us maybe come from a Spanish or Mediterranean context, we know that it has always been connected to this idea of not just the well-being of community and rituals connected to fertility and crops and the change of seasons and food, but also in a symbolic way as a substitute to humans too, as a ritual motive that can be found in sacrifice. And also as a substitute for humans in certain contexts because of the closeness that we find between each other. So these sacrificial ideas, these status as symbols of social status because of being owned, or as offerings that are given to gods, is part of it. But there is also this idea of a transformation as a punishment, as beasts, of humans being punished and being made to look like and behave like and be conscious of being a pig while having a human consciousness. These several scholars have pointed out, for example, in the case of Tirce, the way in which this degradation is not just because it is a non-human animal. It is a pig, and the pig is considered dirty, it is bestial, and it is also feminized in a sexual way. So this kind of gendering of these species and ridiculization makes the situation even worse. Pigs have been tied to stupidity, insolence, mischief, gluttony, impurity, and more recently, it has also, this species has also been considered reclaimed and used against the ruling classes, connected to capitalism, to accumulation of money, etc. The thing here is that while traditionally they have been connected to lower classes and the consumption of not being a symbol of status as such, certain groups that have been connected to pigs or animals, we can see a displaced objection in the way that these very same communities then reclaim this and use it against pigs. So we can say that those without actual power, but figurative power, use the symbol of the pig against those that rule them, but at the same time exert violence towards actual pigs. And in the context of Judeo-Christian ambiguities, the pig has been also used to define and to delineate a boundary between the civilized and the uncivilized, connected to racist stereotypes. But also in the case of Spain, there has been recent research talking about how the pig, as a part of our culinary tradition, is part of an affirmation of pro-Christian ideology, especially against Muslims. So we can see that pigs are connected to femininity and to misogyny and cases in a construct with boars, the wild, and masculinity. We can also see that it is connected to accumulation and negative stereotypation of fatness, and also connected to class, both as something that the upper classes wouldn't consume, but the upper classes are actually represented as pigs and greedy, and that there is a lot of mockery going on when we see these kind of transformations. So what happens with these representations? What do they tell us about pigs? I would argue that not much. The instances in which they speak and actually communicate things of agency and subjectivity, we can say of them talking by themselves. What we can see is they mostly appear connected to food and being consumed, and there are many jokes around that, both in images and text. Sometimes the pigs mock about them being happy to be so tasty or giving sausages. It is kind of a macabre situation there. But I will just summarize this by saying that they sometimes appear as happy meat or as an eager victim that is willing to give their own life for humans or the situation, as a killer or exploitative capitalist forces, or also connected, as another one of our colleagues said, to cannibalism, as in the case of wolves. So how do I look into this? From the area I come from, critical animal studies, we look into this type of representations by looking at how cultural filters distort and condition the way we perceive these animals. Because we argue there can be harmful impressions of the real animals, like in this case, for example, pigs are always connected to being dirty and smelly and nasty, but pigs can't even sweat, actually. So being reminded of dirtiness in this case is because we remember them in their context of exploitation, not because of their habit even. And why children's literature? Well, it is not only does children's literature usually use a lot of animals to communicate messages, but also it is really interesting because it allows us not only to show other realities, but also to expose adults to these realities through children. Because sometimes we think about children's literature as we just indoctrinate, we teach them, we get their messages and how we should behave to them. But while they consume these messages, adults themselves also question how we have been doing things, and children ask a lot of questions. So when we are looking into how these animals appear, usually people analyze it by generating typologies and categories, looking into it is more positive or negative representation. But from critical animal studies, this is usually analyzed as judgments of utility and category membership. We look into how this represents the material reality of these animals and how we are categorizing it connected to our empathy to them. So in the case of pigs, as I argued before, it is really tied to food socialization process of understanding them as funny, as cute, as friendly, but making this kind of division between food and friends, and pigs coexist in this situation. If I have more time later, or if anyone has a question, there are several axes that are used to analyze animals in this context, usually connected to how visible they are or invisible, and how objectified or how much subjectivity we can see, but also connected on how animal-centered or anthropocentric the stories are. So what happens with pigs, what happens with Peppa Pig, what happens with many of the popular culture figures we see nowadays? There is this thing called the meat paradox or the Peppa Pig paradox, where even in theatrical representations of Peppa Pig, we are offered sausages and ham and bacon, and they are not eating the friend. They don't make this connection. And sociologists have looked into this kind of representation to see what's going on and how this differentiation of being absent as an animal but still represented as one might be working. And that would be the previous context. The thing is, I'm not going to analyze mainstream culture in this case. I'm going to look into animal-centered literature and how it might be diverting. I don't know if you're familiar with Charlotte Webb's or Babe, the Brave Pig stories. There are many more stories like this going on at the moment, mostly centered around rescued animals or animals as pets. And in the case of pigs, there are many real-life inspired stories going on, connected to being used in cinema, but mostly to escaping and coming outside of an exploitative context, which is the one that most of them are. We can see some stories in which they try to show us the personality of these animals as individuals and show us how they might be living the world, so that when we read about pigs, we are actually reading about pigs. And then others try to, from a more moralistic and didactic nature, they try to make it useful and make humans connect with pigs as friends. The thing I'm going to look into now is the journey or the escape, or this kind of trope that is appearing a lot in this type of literature. That is the idea of pigs escaping from an exploitative context and reaching a better situation. And while I won't go in depth, I'm going to show you two examples of this case. In these two different books, the hero, the protagonist, starts in a truck that goes usually to the slaughterhouse, and they come from a factory farm. Now, while one of them appears in the farm before, everything happens through the truck, through this escape, which is actually quite often which happens. There are many news coverage about this, but it is not so uncommon to see that pigs escape trucks that go to slaughterhouses. Both of them make this kind of jump and reach a nature environment or a wild environment in which they interact in many different ways. In the first case, we can see that this pig that is now free, at least in the sense of outside of this exploitative context, starts to explore the surroundings. And they talk from senses and from the way that they perceive things. They smell, they breathe, the deliciousness of the forest that they have never been in. They move around in the mud, and then they move around to go to a more human space. But we can see this kind of really centered in the senses and their perception. The other journey is defined by the fact that the farmer realizes this pig escaped and tries to find this pig again to take to the slaughterhouse. And there are other kind of adventures connected to predators with a cougar and this kind of adventurous situation. The end is connected to humans. In the first case, this pig will be named Sprig. They are named, they are given a leash, a name and a person, and we might think that that's about it. But that's not the end. The home is actually a sanctuary that this pig is brought into, because they realize that a city is not a place for a pig either. They shouldn't be dogs, even if we compare with them so much. And then the home for the other one is directly a sanctuary where this pig, which is on the screen, which is a pig that the story was inspired on, reaches this kind of multi-species family. So what does all of this mean? What do these examples bring to the table? We can see that there are these narratives of escaping that start with a track and escape. And we have this journey which reminds us to this myth of the hero's journey, where they confront different threats and adventures and learn to be themselves outside of this context. And these animals go from being victims to being maybe a hero or a sidekick in different adventures. The home is not defined by their bigness in the sense of what we stereotypically connect to them, and it is not the wild or the city. It is something outside of these boundaries. So we have this way of defining animality, what an animal is, but also escaping contexts of violence that are not explicitly shown because it's children's literature, but it is there. So my closing remarks would be more than answers or a profound analysis on this. I have questions. I have questions about whether or not the pig is shown as an animal or themselves, or if these kind of constructions are given into another type of myth. If there is a way to redefine the way that these animals appear by themselves, and if they can escape these stereotypes, this simplification, being considered dull, unintelligent, or just being seen as victims of society. I have more questions than answers, and I am happy to discuss them, but this would be it for today for me. Thank you.
Thank you all. Thank you to the four of you. Sofía, Olympia, I think that you are at home. Yeah. Si hay alguna pregunta en la sala, if there is any question, es vuestro momento. También alguna pregunta si hay por el chat. Estoy pendiente, bueno, estamos pendientes. Hay una pregunta, me dicen. Vale. A ver. Vale, Miguel, no sé si está por el chat o... vale, tienes micro. Vale.
Hola, ¿se me ve y se me escucha correctamente?
Sin problema, sí.
Hola. Bueno, más que una pregunta, es un comentario muy extenso, así que voy a tratar de resumir o al menos de ir muy rápido. Primero quería hacer un comentario general y casi un desahogo personal. Yo empecé a investigar dentro de la línea de los estudios de animales hace unos años. Por entonces éramos pocos. Seguimos siéndolo, pero me alegra ver que cada vez más personas están haciendo pesquisas magníficas en esta dirección. Gracias a todas y enhorabuena por representar los estudios de animales en este panel de Tartalo. Es una visibilidad que nuestro campo necesitaba como el comer, sobre todo en la Academia Española. Paso a comentar un par de cosillas de cada una de las ponentes. Trataré de ir muy deprisa porque tengo muchas notas. Sobre Sofía, creo que has hecho un repaso muy correcto de la historia cultural del lobo. Además, has realizado un análisis lúcido de las fábulas esópicas, que es una de mis especialidades. Sí te quería hacer un par de apuntes. Dentro de la cristiandad medieval hay que destacar a los santos domesticadores de fieras. El caso más emblemático es el de Francisco de Asís, con su historia sobre el lobo de Gubbio, que es una de las fuentes primarias, del que también ha escrito un poema Rubén Darío. Otra nota, el cuento de Caperucita posee raíces orales por si las quisieras explorar. Otra sugerencia personal. A mi juicio, te ha faltado por reseñar, dentro de esta síntesis, entiendo que el tiempo no daba para todo, dos obras paradigmáticas para lo lobuno dentro del periodo entre siglos entre el XIX y el XX, en la literatura anglosajona. Primero, Jack London, con La llamada de la selva y Colmillo Blanco, que sería un eslabón dentro del nature writing, ¿vale? Y otro eslabón que procede esta vez del venero antropomórfico de la fábula. Kipling, con El libro de la selva, muy conocido. Te recomiendo o te propongo, si quieres, que consultes mi artículo El mito del lobo bueno, que publiqué el año pasado. Ahí vas a encontrar estas referencias, mis interpretaciones sobre ellas y más bibliografía que a lo mejor te puede resultar útil. En cuanto al lobo en la literatura infantil, has hecho también, Sofía, una revisión de algunos de los títulos más relevantes, algunos yo los conocía y además has tocado temas que considero esenciales. En cuanto a este asunto, tengo un artículo en revisión, pero no te puedo dar más detalles. Entonces, si te interesa y te apetece, lo podemos discutir por correo electrónico en otro momento. Paso a Olimpia. Bueno, mis felicitaciones por una exposición clara, sintética, que toca bastantes de los puntos principales de la mitología y la literatura del zorro. Evidentemente, en 15 minutos no da tiempo a hablarlo todo, pero sí que creo que hace falta referirse a los antecedentes de las fábulas griegas, lo que vino antes de ellas, proverbios y cuentos sumerios y mesopotámicos, a los que Kolb dedicó un libro en 2013, si no me falla la memoria. No me ha dado tiempo a cotejarlo. Lo tienes todo esto en mi libro Vulpes sin fábula, que se publicó hace un año. Allí también encontrarás, si te interesa leerlas, algunas de mis interpretaciones de cómo ciertas conductas reales de los zorros fueron más tarde literaturizadas, moralizadas y simbolizadas en los apólogos. También, por si deseas explorar esta línea, creo que habría que mencionar otro depósito de sabiduría y conocimiento sobre el zorro, que luego aprovechó el apólogo y las obras enciclopédicas medievales que tú muy bien has señalado. Me refiero a la zoología grecolatina, las historias naturales de Aristóteles, Plinio y Eliano, entre otros, cuya influencia en los tratados científicos ha sido muy perdurable todavía hasta el siglo XIX, como aspiro a explicar en una obra que tengo actualmente en prensa. Por lo demás, las representaciones contemporáneas han estado perfectamente elegidas y muy bien analizadas, entonces en eso no tengo nada que decir, solo mi enhorabuena. De Olatz no puedo agregar nada porque se sale un poco de mi línea, entonces solo le doy mis felicitaciones y paso, porque he aprendido cosas que no sabía sobre este tema, y paso a Belén. Una exposición magnífica, Belén, con una exégesis muy atinada de la fábula esópica, y una presentación muy original de la simbología heráldica valenciana y catalana, que me ha gustado mucho y que no conocía para nada. Solo te quería hacer unos 3 apuntes. La redención del murciélago no se observa solo en discursos recientes, sino que aparece en torno al siglo XIX gracias a la divulgación científica. Gracias a la divulgación científica, el murciélago se revaloriza en España e imagino que también en muchas partes de Europa, porque lo que se intenta poner en valor en estos textos, que a veces aparecen publicados en periódicos, es su utilidad para los agricultores. Es decir, comían insectos y plagas que perjudicaban a los sembrados. Como podemos ver, siempre existe un pensamiento antropocéntrico que ha salido aquí mencionado varias veces, que busca por encima de todo el beneficio de los intereses materiales de nuestra especie. Por otro lado, la fábula del murciélago que cambia de bando, así como el tópico de la guerra de los animales, es antiquísima, grecolatina, y todavía podríamos trazar su origen a la literatura oral. Por si te interesa el dato, este apólogo reaparece bastantes veces en la literatura fabulística de los siglos XVIII y XIX, como tú ya habías mencionado. Yo he inventariado muchas de sus versiones en un artículo que se publicó el año pasado en el Boletín de Literatura Oral, por si quieres consultarlo. Sobre vampirismo, un brevísimo apunte. La creencia de la succión de sangre en realidad viene de las brujas durante la Edad Moderna, si es que no tiene orígenes más remotos, como yo mencioné precisamente en otro panel de Tártalo ayer mismo. Fue transferida al murciélago, al vampiro, por las razones que tú has enumerado. Nocturnidad, la idea de que hay una serie de animales dañinos o perniciosos, y sí, una advertencia así un poquito general con este tema, porque hay que tener cuidado a la hora de estudiar a los vampiros durante la Edad Moderna, ya que su imagen no se consolida hasta finales del siglo XIX más o menos, hasta el Drácula de Bram Stoker y Carmila de Le Fanu. Hoy que ya vivimos en la época postcrepúsculo, donde los vampiros pueden brillar o ir al instituto con las Monster High, pues las cosas han cambiado un poco. Pero por entonces los monstruos todavía no tenían todos la configuración que ahora poseen. Y una recomendación bibliográfica final que parte de mi experiencia personal. Mi novia me contó hace tiempo que su abuela, que era gaditana, llamaba a los murciélagos pajaritos del diablo. Si no me falla la memoria, habría que corroborarlo, existe un artículo en la revista de folclore de gran importancia para la investigación etnográfica, donde se desarrolla esta idea y se habla de la percepción popular del murciélago. No te lo he podido verificar ahora mientras estabas hablando porque quería escucharte, pero bueno, yo te lo dejo ahí por si le quieres echar un ojo. Espero no estar inventándomelo. Y nada más, como coda, recuerdos de Irene Pacheco, que es mi compañera de despacho. Con eso he terminado. Perdón por este larguísimo monólogo.
De acuerdo, Miguel. No sé si algunos de nuestros panelistas tiene algo que añadir. No, me parece. No. Vale, pues entonces voy a abrir el suelo a preguntas. Vale, a un par de ellas. Vale, perfecto. Si no, tenía yo, así que me alegro que estemos dispuestos a mantener conversación.
Pues muchas gracias a los cuatro. Me ha parecido súper interesante este acercamiento porque, por ejemplo, pues yo trabajo el rol en vivo, entonces es mucho encarnación de personas y personajes y para mí el ver los animales desde este punto en el que contamos tantas historias, transmitimos el mito y sobre todo lo podemos reconfigurar. Muchísimas gracias por las 4 exposiciones. Mi pregunta sobre todo va para Sofía y Olatz, porque la obra que me ha venido un poco a la cabeza y que, bueno, mi pregunta es si la habéis analizado con los animales que representáis es Fábulas. Si lo conocéis, los cómics que reinterpretan todas estas fábulas típicas en las que, por ejemplo, el lobo es súper importante, es un personaje esencial y como yo creo que reconfigura mucho esa violencia, ¿no? o muchas cosas asociadas a él. Y sí que con la reflexión de Olatz me hace pensar cómo los 3 cerditos vuelven a salir ahí, pero hay un componente de violencia, aunque sea mucho más adulta, porque Fábulas es un cómic para adultos, cómo sigue intrínseca, ¿no? O si, bueno, eso, si habéis analizado alguna obra, que a mí se me ha ocurrido esta, pero que sea contemporánea y adulta, y si veis si ha cambiado un poco la percepción del animal. Gracias.
Por mi parte, te voy a pedir luego la referencia concreta. Yo tengo que decir que esto no tiene mucho que ver con mi tesis en sí, es algo que estoy empezando a explorar y tengo más que nada como el marco teórico, entonces me parece maravilloso que nos hayas dado esta recomendación porque precisamente estoy buscando más cosas en las que mirar este tipo de tropos, etcétera. Así que no puedo desarrollar porque no lo conocía y tampoco he analizado nada contemporáneo que se salga de la literatura infantil vegana, que es como un nicho todavía más pequeño. Pero muchísimas gracias por tu comentario y mi apreciación.
Vale, muchas gracias. Os voy a pedir, I'm going to ask you for a last round of applause and we will be finished.